Okay, welcome everybody. Just to remind you that we're being broadcast online and throughout Parliament buildings, and just want to welcome those who are watching online today. So if you can ensure your mobile phones are muted, and to remind you that no recording or photography of the meeting is allowed. So if you're content, we'll proceed with the agenda. So in terms of apologies, we have apologies from Sinead McLaughlin. She is with the committee Economy Committee this afternoon, and they are actually out at a site visit and it's run over, and I think we're still waiting for Claire Sugden to arrive. Okay, in terms of declarations of interest, have anybody got any?
So the only thing I was thinking about was when we're discussing civil contingencies, I covered for Deirdre Harkey for 6 months. Okay. When the COVID inquiry, when I was reading the minutes, I just thought I should have declared an interest, even though it's talking about future ones, but just to have it in a record.
I think that's useful. Thank you. Carol, any others? Go ahead, please.
Just declare I'm a member of the Committee for Communities, just the item of correspondence, although I think that's yet to be replied to.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll proceed then. So, Chairperson's business. So, I have 2 items today. The first is to note, which is a note of the informal meeting that took place between the Deputy Chair, the Clerk and myself with the co-chairs of the Truth Recovery Independent Panel. We discussed this last week briefly, and it was emailed out to members. Members content to note that. Okay, and then just in terms of the second item of correspondence, it's from the First Minister and Deputy First Minister seeking to arrange a meeting to discuss the inquiry and the redress legislative timeframe for the Truth Recovery and Redress Bill, and just to advise that an informal meeting is being explored for next week for, again, the Deputy Chair, the Clerk and myself, and we will keep you posted when the arrangements have been finalised, and we will ensure that a note of the meeting is circulated to members following that. Okay, members, in terms of draft minutes then, moving on, you'll find these on pages 10 to 21 of the pack, and if you're content with these, I'll go ahead and sign them. Go ahead.
Just one thing, 14th of May, Razor bring in their paper and legacy on the Republic. This is a book I referenced in the chamber before regarding industrial explosives that have come out of the south, and if possible, could you pass that on to Raise to see if they could if that's any use to them ahead of what they bring in front of the committee on the 14th. It was a very good book. It raises a lot of facts from their role within the Troubles, and I certainly believe that should be part of their paper they can have. So if you pass that round, get the chair to pass it on.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave that with the committee team then. Thank you. Okay, I'll go ahead and sign these. So in terms of matters arising then, so the committee response to the Finance Committee on the Executive Office's budget for 2025-26, you'll find this on pages 3 to 5 of the table pack, the draft response. So I'm going to ask the clerk to read this response paragraph by paragraph, and at the end of each I'll ask you if you're content with it, and or if you have any suggested amendments. Will we go ahead? Yeah, please. So if people have got that open then, pages 3 to 5 of the table pack. Thank you. Go ahead. Do you want to go ahead?
Yes. Okay. So the first paragraph is, it is just to note that the clerk of the committee wrote to the clerk of this committee, so that's why the response is going back clerk to clerk. So it just says on the 23rd of January, the Finance Committee commissioned a round robin written exercise to all statutory committees in the Assembly's Audit Committee to seek views on their respective departments' 25-26 budget. The Committee for the Executive Office received written briefing from the Executive Office on the 19th of March, and at its meeting on the 26th received an oral briefing from departmental officials on the TEO budget for 25-26.
Okay, are members content? Thank you.
The committee at its meeting of the 2nd of April agreed the following response to the round robin exercise, and members appreciate the flexibility shown in relation to accepting input after the response date.
Okay, again, content? Yep. Go ahead, please. Thank you.
And then this heading is General Budgetary Outlook 25-26. Members noted that the executive budget for 25-26 is challenging, although much of the 24-25 Barnett consequentials, that should be baselined into 25-26 budget. It does not meet the bids made by the Executive Office TEO or any of the departments as per the round robin commissioning note. This will be problematic in itself and will be compounded as is expected. There will not be the same opportunities in year to access additional funding through monitoring rounds and consequentials. In the past, TEO has been reliant on in-year allocations to fund key programmes. Taken together, members are concerned that the progress made in previous years can be lost if programmes are scaled back or delayed because of reduced funding.
I just think there's maybe one word missing, or two words there missing. In the past, TEO has been reliant on in-year allocations to fund and continue. I think we found that last year in terms of some of the programmes they couldn't continue. I don't know whether I'm being pedantic, but okay, I remember it's content. We just add those two words.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the next paragraph. Members also noted that pressures arising from pay awards in the coming financial year will be an issue that departments will be required largely to manage themselves. Specifically, the management of the rise in employers' national insurance contributions and other wage and inflationary pressures will be a significant issue faced by TEO and its arm's length bodies.
Content?
Okay. Members noted that the UK Government's Comprehensive Spending Review announcement expected in mid-June will provide for multi-year budgets, 3 years of resource budgeting, and it gives the years 26, 27, 27, 28, 28, 29, and capital budgeting for 4 years, including 29 and 30. Members welcome any move towards multi-year budgets and the increased certainty in terms of programme funding that brings to TEO and for its delivery partners.
Content?
Finally, the committee noted the development of 5-year business plans indicatively to be available in the autumn and looks forward to the mainstreaming of a more strategic approach to budget setting, transformation initiatives, efficiencies and effectiveness, and greater alignment between the programme for government and budgets.
Content?
Yeah.
And then specific issues of interest or concern to the Committee for the Executive Office. So the committee noted briefing that the allocations for TEO agreed by the Executive in the budget for 25-26 are considerably lower than TEO's bids, and this means that many of the TEO pressures cannot be met. And there's a table there which replicates a table from the written briefing the committee got from TEO.
Okay.
And that sets out the bids, the allocations and the shortfall. Members noted that allocations in Resource Del, when taken with the baseline, will enable the current commitments to be taken forward in line with spending plans for ending violence against women and girls, and that the funding for good relations will ensure delivery continues to be maintained at current levels. This is, as noted by members, disappointing given the importance of programmes such as ending violence on women and girls and good relations to communities across Northern Ireland. This leaves no room for emerging needs or expanding provision.
Content? Thank you.
Yeah. Members were also concerned to note that the funding available to NDPBs only partially meets pay and inflationary pressures over and above the baselines that were brought forward. Given that many of TEO's NDPBs undertake statutory functions, members wondered at what point continued reductions in funding would lead to a diminution of the NDPB's ability to discharge its functions fully, efficiently and effectively.
Content?
Right.
Okay.
Members noted that the allocation above baseline for staff costs will allow business critical posts to be filled and current levels of delivery to continue. However, they remain concerned that pay pressures are to be subsumed within the baselines and that the implications of increases in national insurance are not yet known.
Content? Okay.
In terms of earmarked Del, the department states that for 25-26 an allocation of 150 million has been provided in response to requirements of 168 million. This increase is mainly due to increased victim payment in line with the level of forecast determination, the potential in-year cost dependent on legislation for the truth, recovery, redress payments, and costs for the establishment and implementation of a statutory public inquiry. TEO states that it considers this to be a reasonable starting point and it will closely monitor the demand-led requirements during the year.
Content? Okay.
Just one query on that. Obviously 18 million short, and what put down there is mainly due to increases in victims' payments. So obviously they will take priority. Where is the 18 million shortfall going to be absorbed?
I can't answer that. I think if I was to speculate, and I am only speculating, I would suspect that they would hope it would come up in in-year monitoring, or that throughout the year what they had forecast cost would be less than that. And I'm only speculating. I don't have an answer from the department for that question.
That's certainly a budget line we need to keep an eye on.
Okay, thank you. Content otherwise? Yep. Thank you.
Yeah. Capital allocations will allow inescapable pressures to be met, and briefing from TEO states this would primarily provide funding for infrastructure projects within urban villages and Ebrington, and health and safety works at MLK, Maison Kesh, civil contingencies infrastructure, and the Corsica, if I'm saying that correct, lease.
Content? Thank you.
Okay. Members note that it is anticipated that legislation to pass the legal capacity to administer financial transactions capital to the relevant lead departments is anticipated to be in place for 25-26. However, for this year, the net requirement included, there's duplication there that needs to come out, for this year is 2.3 million. The committee is seeking,
That's okay, content? Yeah.
The committee is seeking further information on a number of areas within the TEO budget, for example, the North West Development Fund, costs of the overseas bureaus, and is exploring the good use of public money in relation to accommodation and establishment costs. It will maintain a watching brief on the impact of reduced opportunities for in-year allocations on delivery of key areas of the department's work, including good relations and ending violence against women and girls.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody got any suggestions or anything that they feel is missing or do we better highlight it? No.
We'll just need more money.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So I'll just. Okay, so with no further suggestions then, so are we content then that the response is forwarded to the Finance Committee today, and that this will form the basis of my speech in the debate on the Finance Committee's report next week? Okay.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. So 5.7, Victims Payment Scheme panel session. So I would refer members to pages 7 to 8 of the table pack and advise that a briefing note has been prepared in relation to the Victim Payments Scheme panel session, which is indicatively scheduled for our meeting on Wednesday the 21st of May. I'm going to ask the clerk to speak to the briefing note, please.
Just by way of background, so previously the committee had discussed having a session with a panel or several panels in relation to this, but in the interim week, just from contact with a clerk and colleague in DOJ, we understand that the Relatives for Justice have also written to that committee to raise the same issues, and that so to reflect that, we're proposing that in a change of approach, which is that we would, in the first instance, send the Relatives for Justice letter to the department and ask them to respond, and that the Justice Committee would be looking for a response from Justice. At that point then the clerks from the two committees could get together, delineate what, because there is some crossover between Justice and TEO in relation to this. So administration of the scheme lies with Justice, but the sponsorship of the board and the so on comes from TEO. So just to delineate those areas of responsibility, and then to put forward some options papers for how the two chairs might agree to dispose of what is a matter of joint concern. So there's a number of different ways of doing that, but that we would see what came back first and see what opportunities there are to cooperate between the two committees on this, because it would be, obviously there wouldn't be duplication of work in two committees, but also that you wouldn't be asking the same stakeholders to come up to talk about the same issues in two different committees, potentially quite close, within a month of each other. So it would be a way of coordinating responses between the two. Does anybody?
Okay, any questions on that, please?
So are we still holding, is it the 21st of May, potentially for panels for TEO?
We'll hold them, but we won't confirm them until we figure out where Justice is on this, and we can see how long, what their time frame is and what kind of things come back.
I think something to bear in mind is that it's not just Relatives for Justice we have names for. We have people to populate a couple of panels.
Yes, we do.
So say if it went to DOJ and it was only Relatives for Justice attended that session, it leaves a shortfall for the other groups that we have identified.
I suppose in some ways that we have had that session, and whenever the requests came in from Relatives for Justice, then we sought to set these panels up. So in some ways that was the trigger for it, and I suppose we would have to, if some of this subject matter was moved into a cross committee piece of work, then I think that we would maybe have to look again at what the purpose of that is at this point, because it's not been that long since we have had a Victims and Survivors of the Troubles panel here. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We're talking about a specific issue.
Yes, I know, but I'm saying that we originally were going to set this up to look at the victims' disablement payment. But if we're, so I think that probably the best thing is to allow the clerk to continue that work and come back
Yeah, I'm
possibly
happy with
next
that.
week, and then bottom that out, and then we can look again at the forward work programme in terms of the purpose for that. Is that okay?
Yeah, there's no need to make decisions about inviting or not inviting at this point. It is just to point out the fact that this same issues were raised in another committee, and to look at those, and then you can finalise your own arrangements for how you want to handle it, either together or separately. There's no requirement for you to do it. It can be decided.
Okay. Okay, so moving on then, members, 5.1 to 5.4 and 5.6. So this is in relation to truth recovery. So I'm going to refer you to pages 26 to 104 of the meeting pack and page 6 of the table papers. Okay, so the Executive Office's response to the committee from our correspondence of the 4th of February on the truth recovery briefing of the 29th of January. Page 5.2, Truth Recovery Panel's response to committee correspondence of the 14th of February, following up on issues raised at that meeting on the 29th of January. That's 5.3. Clerk's memo summarising developments to date. 5.1. The Hansard of the committee meeting of the 29th of January. 5.4. And an advice note from the clerk on a suggested approach to addressing issues raised in evidence in closed session on truth recovery, gender perspectives, and in responses to subsequent correspondence. 5.6 of the table papers. So I'm going to ask the clerk to speak to this issue again, please.
Okay, so it is just to say that there were a number of issues that the committee will wish to consider before forming a view on how to respond to the correspondence and the information that has come back from both of those, and what further actions, if any, are required in relation to that. And given the sensitivity of some of the issues, and as evidence was initially taken in closed session, advice was sought from senior procedural and legal colleagues, and I was advised as the clerk that it would be prudent to defer consideration of these matters until next week, until the committee has an opportunity to take some legal advice about some of the issues in relation to the correspondences.
Are members content?
I'm content. I mean, the complaints are made in closed session, and the complaints are also made probably to me and others who have met different groupings. And it's clear none of them talk to each other, but the complaints are the same, if not very similar. And I'm assuming the lack of communication between groups is just due to the trauma, and to be frank, I don't think it was handled very well by officials, TO officials, in terms of, you know, maybe at the start getting someone in with particular skills around facilitation rather than the latter end. There's reasons for everything, but it's just that I think just to try and bring us to the nth degree, we need to exhaust everything, including legal advice, because at the end of the day it was given to this committee, and we need to be seen, and not just be seen, but to try and get some responses to accusations that were made.
Okay. Go ahead, please, Timothy.
Regarding 5.2, the responses that we received regarding the consultation forum.
Sorry, could you just start that sentence again, please? Sorry, I was hearing something.
I think it was 5.2 regarding the consultation forum and the responses we got.
Yes.
There's a number of things in the responses that certainly I believe merit a lot more exploratory work by this committee. Some of the things that's, question 3, the answer that we've got to it throws up numerous questions in my mind.
Should we possibly go into closed session, or do you...
No, well, what I would like...
I don't want to go into specifics as such, if you can keep it quite high.
But I think there needs to be a panel assembled to look at this. And I'm not going to say anything, don't worry, Ross, you see you're getting nervous there, but, looking at some of the things that have been raised in here for us to explore them. And I think there'd be benefit in establishing a panel, because we need to understand, and not going into any legal technicalities, but how this actually came about, this whole process came about, and how the consultation forum was established. Because I think there's a failing on the preparatory work to establish it, as well as what has happened when it has been up.
I think that this is, yes, I think you've really hit the nail on the head in terms of the understanding of this committee of how we have gotten from the birth mothers and the children, adoptee children, adults now, asking for support and redress, etc., and how we've actually got to this point now, and all the mechanisms and forums and panels, etc. So I wonder if that may be something we could be looking at separate to your work around the legal advice, but also then maybe get somebody up from TO to give us a sort of backstory as to how we got all this in terms of who was appointed to the panel, because will be good preparatory work for whenever we actually get the redress bill in front of us.
The people would have in mind, you're talking about bringing somebody from TO, that needs to be the lead person in the department that was involved in setting this process up and oversees the process. Wave is mentioned in here, potentially a clinical psychologist that has been involved in some of this.
Okay, I think
them would be the people that I think it would be good for this committee to explore this with.
Okay.
Can I just suggest that those potential actions are also part of any discussion that we might have in relation to legal advice? And
no problem with that.
okay,
yeah.
so can we maybe
and if again, my advice to you is not to rehearse these things publicly in advance of getting some advice, and then we can work our way through all of the issues systematically, having got that advice.
With that, we'll get the legal advice and then we'll take it from there.
is that okay? Go ahead, please, Deputy Chair.
All I was going to say was there's something I would like to say, but we would need to go into private session to discuss what I was going to say. But I can wait until the legal advice comes. It's
You just
fine.
make a wee note.
it's grand.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay,
So sorry, so we're trying to be cautious here.
do you want me to go and
Because at the end of the day, Stuart, what you may say in private session may have a bearing on the type of legal advice we're going to get.
I do.
Okay, well maybe go
Okay.
into closed session then, please, if members are content.
Great.
Okay, thank you. The previous session there, we had a closed session with survivors together, and I'm going to ask the clerk to read the actions coming out of that, or would you like me to? You got them okay?
I have. If I
Okay,
miss
no, go
any
ahead.
out,
Yes,
you
go ahead.
jump in.
Please, thank you.
Okay, so we have right to the Executive Office to ask how trauma-informed approach is implemented or is reflected across the departments, what it means in practice and for the departments and for their statutory agencies. Then to write to the Housing Executive to ask them about how the point system reflects a trauma-informed approach and how those two interact.
Especially in the context
In
of
the context,
HIA.
in the context of HIS for people who have survivors and victims of HIA. The next thing we have is to write to the Department for Communities and ask about the same aspect. Ask about how a trauma-informed approach is reflected in assessments that are undertaken for PIP, especially by the assessments that happen through Capita. Yeah. And then the fourth one is to write to the NIO to because it was responsible for training schools and prisons at that time, and to ask them what oversight role they had, if any, how they discharged that oversight role, and basically what records there are of people who were in training schools and borsals at that time. So that's, let me see, that's 4. So number 5 is to ask for a paper on good practice for historical institutional abuse victims in terms of trauma-informed approach globally for the delivery of services and support in the longer term. Then to write to the Victims and Survivors Service to ask how they're continuing to promote the services, support and services that are available. So then to write to the Department of Health and the Health to ask them to liaise with the health trusts in response to
Social care.
to our questions in relation to social care, specifically about care, end of life care, and nursing home and residential care home. And to write to Hawks, the head of the civil service, to ask about basically about what the process is for nominations for the King's Award.
Thank you.
King's Honours, I should say, sorry.
Thank you. Okay, are members content with those actions? Okay, and I'll thank you in advance for your work on those. So members, we're going forward now. Our second briefing is on civil contingencies, and we're going to have a departmental briefing. I'm just going to check everybody's content that Hansard record this session. Okay, thank you. Okay, members, so you'll find the clerk's brief at pages 110 to 112, and in your table pack you'll find the departmental briefing paper, pages 10 to 16. So you're very welcome. So we have Colin Moffat, who is the Director, Civil Contingencies Division at the Executive Office, and we have Jane Holmes, who is Director of COVID Strategy, Recovery and Inquiry at the Executive Office. So you're both very welcome, and thank you for sending through your briefing paper in advance of the meeting. Would you like to go ahead and make some opening remarks, please?
Sure, thank you. I will make a start, if you're okay. So first of all, just to send apologies from Karen Pearson, so Karen's Deputy Secretary and TO, and has overarching responsibility for this group, and unfortunately couldn't be here today. She sends her apologies. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to come to the committee today and provide briefing on the work of the Civil Contingencies Division and the COVID inquiry, including implementation of the Module 1 recommendations. You've noted then that you've received the briefing that's been prepared in advance, and should have received the response to the Module 1 report that was published by the Executive on the 16th of January of this year. We plan then to keep our time today for comments and queries if we can, and I'll use some of the opening remarks just to make a few kind of opening key points. So as you said, I'm Colin Moffat, Director of Civil Contingencies Division, and this is Jane Holmes, who is over the COVID Strategy, Recovery and Inquiry work. As you're aware, the Civil Contingencies Division supports the Executive in the delivery of civil contingencies here through the provision of policy, strategy, control and coordination. The COVID-19 pandemic and the resultant inquiry shone a light on civil contingencies arrangements across the UK and highlighted improvements that were necessary to adequately address the needs of citizens and our population here. Since the pandemic, there has been progress in relation to enhancing civil contingencies arrangements here as a direct result of the pandemic and subsequently the inquiry. A number of improvements that were identified during the course of the pandemic have already been implemented. So for instance, the Civil Contingencies Hub, which is an information sharing mechanism deployed during an emergency response to provide situational awareness and to enhance decision making across all levels, including NI departments and key partners, has been operationalised and redeveloped, repurposed. It was formally stood up at first in March 2020 to coordinate the response during the first wave of the pandemic, and in April 2020, Anthony Harbison, who was Chief of Staff of the Hub at that time, commissioned a review of the Hub to maximise its effectiveness should it be required in the future. This resulted in a streamlined set of arrangements for the Hub that were deployed the following autumn to simultaneously manage the potential impacts of the UK leaving the European Union and then winter emergencies alongside the second wave of the pandemic. Other key improvements that have been made following the first wave of the pandemic were the development of the Civil Contingencies Framework, which was first published in August 2021, and the NI-specific Civil Contingencies Risk Register. So the framework now reflects the standardised approach to dealing with emergencies through distinct phases of prepare, respond and recover. The framework was last updated in November 2023 and a review is planned for the current year. That will include changes arising from the COVID inquiry, the Module 1 report specifically, equality impact assessments and a renewed focus on development a protocol for vulnerable people. Prior to the pandemic, NI did not have its own bespoke risk register. Instead, we operated under the UK Government's National Security Risk Assessment, which provided very limited local insight, truth be told. We have therefore led on the development of a bespoke risk register for Northern Ireland since then. Moreover, a learning and development strategy has been developed and is currently being rolled out. As a result, there is one cycle of training delivered in 2023, two in 2024, and one cycle is partially complete for the current year, with further cycles due later in the year. There have been about 395 delegates attend those courses so far, drawn from 41 different departments and agencies. The pandemic also highlighted that additional resources were needed within TEO to effectively deploy the responsibilities associated with civil contingencies here. So as a direct result, and as an example of that, the Civil Contingencies Division was formerly headed as a branch at grade 7 level. It was then created as a division and now has grade 5 control, and the team has expanded from 6 people pre-pandemic to 25 now, so a very significant investment there. Turning now to the COVID inquiry, TEO is providing evidence for 7 of the 10 modules of the COVID-19 inquiry, and I'm sure you appreciate this has been a very significant undertaking for the department. We are, however, nearing the end of the evidence provision stage. On the Module 1 report and recommendations, you'll be aware that the recommendations are primarily pitched at a UK-wide level, and our focus then is on implementing what will make a difference here. It's important that we continue to factor in constitutional and financial considerations as we consider next steps for implementation in that regard. To support implementation, a cross-departmental modular steering group made up of representatives from all of our departments was established in October of 2024 to progress consideration of the recommendations outlined in the Module 1 report. The work of that group includes a work stream on stakeholder engagement, as we recognise the views of those directly impacted by the pandemic are essential in informing the actions taken in response to recommendations from that report and how they are implemented. That work is at an early stage, and it's anticipated the approach for Module 1 will be expanded as future module reports are published. In terms of those future modular reports, we have been advised that a report on Module 2 will be published this autumn, and it will cover 4 sub-modules, so it'll be 2, A, B and C. Those will be the modules that made up Module 2C in its totality. Given the modular nature of the inquiry, we'd be happy to provide further updates to the committee as we progress through the response of Module 1 recommendations and then future reports as they're published. I thank you there and open for questions.
Do you want to make any opening remarks at this stage?
That covered both of us.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you so much. So the Module 1 report, as you say, it was primarily focused on a UK-wide level, but it did indicate and point to that our system of government here has become too burdensome, sorry, I can't say the word, too complex, too bureaucratic. So what work are you doing as a department then in terms of engaging with other departments to sort of learn some of the lessons around some of the barriers that impeded sort of quick decision making during the pandemic? Please.
So, as I've said in the opening remarks there, a steering group has been established with all departments fitting in there. There's also a range of other structures that we have that we're engaged in terms of the learning from the inquiry for civil contingencies. We are looking at rationalising the structures, so it's not necessarily initially about simplifying them, but it's about rationalising them and making sure that each of the structures we have has a core purpose, clearly understood, the right people are in the right place at the right time, with the right information, to ensure we're making effective decisions. So that is a piece of work that's ongoing. It will need to go through next board and through the executive in time if we want to make any changes to that, but that work is ongoing. So
does this relate to the CCGNI, Civil Contingencies Group then? So they met in March and then they're scheduled to meet again in June. So are minutes and reports going to be published in relation to those meetings? Or will it just...
I would have to check if they are published, but minutes and notes of those meetings are taken and then shared obviously among membership.
Okay. They're not maybe put in the public domain then?
I would need to check if they are. I'm not totally sure if they are.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of the meeting that I think it was the Deputy First Minister had with the Northern Ireland bereaved families on the 24th of February, was there any discussion around Northern Ireland specific COVID inquiry?
Yes, this was raised by the bereaved families as something that they would be in favour of. Okay. So there was an action that was taken away that the Executive Office, so my team is looking at what is practiced, what is being done in other jurisdictions, taking into account what's happening in England, Scotland and Wales and in the Republic of Ireland. So we are producing a report on potential options for that. Okay,
and have you set a target for when that you'll be able to report back on that?
Well, it's a piece of work that we want to progress within the next 3 months.
Okay, yeah. so it's quite imminent. Okay, just one question. I was at a good event, I'm not sure whether everybody else was there, and it was around the use of data capture and sharing information across the UK, and was reacting in relation to non-molestation orders, but it's sort of the same sort of area in terms of being able to process information from different parts of the UK, different computer systems, getting them all into one system, and then possibly using technological capabilities or AI even to churn it out in a meaningful way. So can you maybe speak to how you have reflected on the recommendations around a whole system civil emergency preparedness and resilience model in relation to data? That's really what I'm looking at.
Data is something, to be honest, I would want to take advice and come back to you in writing in terms of where the NISR, so the Northern Ireland Statistics and Research Agency position would be on that. What I would say from our perspective though is that data has been identified obviously as a key area. It's one of the recommendations in the report, and it is really key in terms of both preparing and responding in future pandemics or any emergency for that matter. There's quite a lot of work going on in that area, but as you've highlighted, it's a very complex area. There's huge administrative and legal barriers to it, whether it be different IT systems being used, whether it be in different trust areas or different agencies or departments of government, and that all does need work through. But it's a very complex area. You'd appreciate I wouldn't have the information on that NISR hold, but we can.
It has been looked
into. It's been looked
Yeah.
at through recommendation 5 of the report. It is an area of focus.
Okay, and I suppose again the presentation we heard yesterday was just in that non-molestation order, but I was very conscious that a lot of the issues during the pandemic related to north-south in terms of sharing information about the cross-border spread of the virus, for example. And I suppose whilst this is a UK-wide inquiry into COVID, I'm just wondering to what degree are you engaging with your counterparts in the Republic of Ireland around some of the new structures or learning, etc., that you'll be taking forward?
Could you say something about during the pandemic?
Yes, so during the pandemic there was statistics that were very relevant to the cross-border area, because we're very aware that there were different NPIs in place, the non-pharmaceutical interventions, and kind of aware of the fact that people might take advantage of those ones being able to travel easily. So one of the particular difficulties that there was on the passenger locator form for people flying into flying into Ireland and then travelling to the north. So those were areas that we're very conscious of.
Yes.
There was ongoing engagement at the very senior level with the Republic of Ireland on trying to resolve those matters, and there was ministerial meetings as well. So it's something that we are conscious of. So it's a piece of work that we do want to pick up. It's obviously not at the point that we have made in our response to the Module 1 report, that we're not just talking about the 4 nations. We do have the common travel area to take into account, so it's something that we're aware
So
of.
that is something that will come forward in the future, but I suppose I would be conscious that some of the recommendations that would probably work well in GB, even bringing in Northern Ireland, but there's also there's some peculiar circumstances around an all-Ireland approach to these sort of emergencies. So
there absolutely is, and on an ongoing basis, more broad than just the pandemic, there's ongoing conversations with the Office of Emergency Planning in the Republic of Ireland, and we have ongoing engagement with them as recent as earlier this week, and we're identifying some of the same sorts of issues come out of recommendations here that we'll need to consider on that cross-border basis. So it's broader than just the pandemic.
it is ongoing. That's reassuring. Thank you. Please, Deputy Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. This has been useful, and I appreciate that the bulk of what you've been talking to us about is around the COVID experience, the COVID inquiry, and where we're likely, what the learning points are from that going forward. But in your briefing paper to us, you've said that you've set aside a capital fund, or you've a bid, for a capital fund of just over £500,000 in the coming financial year to establish an emergency operations briefing room capable of linking in with the UK Cabinet Office briefing room. What's the current situation without that facility? And were there no legacy facilities handed over at the time from previous direct rule arrangements?
There's no legacy arrangements that are currently in place, that's what I'd say. The current arrangements I describe as being workarounds, so not really fit for purpose for having all ministers around the table receiving the same briefing at the same time. Now there are workarounds to facilitate that, but in terms of where best practice would be of having co-location, that's what that is supposed to do.
And just again in broad terms, what's your relationship like with the Northern Ireland office in terms of how you've said to us you've regular contact with your colleagues in the Republic of Ireland. What's your contact with specifically in the Northern Ireland office and then the wider United Kingdom aspect of civil contingencies?
Similar in that we have quite a bit of engagement with both the NIO and then more broadly now primarily with the Cabinet Office in terms of UK government, because there are risks that we would be either thinking about, not necessarily dealing with, that are non-devolved but would have an impact here if they were realised. So we have that ongoing conversation with NIO. I mean, there's meetings happening right now with NIO on a couple of different issues that are fairly routine, and the same thing with Cabinet Office. So that engagement happens east-west, north-south.
And in terms of any specific incident that occurs, are there clear rules? I hope there are, but are there clear rules and guides in place which determine which area has responsibility, particularly in relation to, for example, the police that have got a very strong command structure, silver and gold and all of that, how all that relates together and how that all pulls together at the top in the event of a specific event?
There are very clear structures and rules and procedures, guidance and protocol in terms of where responsibility sits, whether it is UKG and whether it's like say Cabinet Office led, whether it's here, and some of that does then get driven by where the operational responsibility should sit, whether it's PSNI or others, but that's fairly clear.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Carol, please.
So I just want to declare an interest. I was on the executive during COVID from June 2020 to December 2020 and was in front of the COVID inquiry. I'm just really keen, I don't know what page it is for you, maybe page 20, but you did say that you were conscious of the inquiry's recommendations to simplify the structures for whole system civil emergency and preparedness, and you're keen to assure yourselves that establishing a new statutory body would not run counter to the ethos of a more streamlined system. What does that mean?
I think that recommendation 10 that relates to, so recommendation 10 of the inquiry's report is for UKG in consultation with the devolved administrations to establish a new statutory body. Essentially what that language means, Cabinet Office and UKG lead on that. We will be consulted and we will provide views. But I do think there is a possible tension, not saying there is a full tension, with recommendation 1, which talks about simplifying structures while also looking at establishing a new statutory body.
That's why I'm asking.
And that's where we think it does need more work at a policy level to work that through to make sure that you're not simplifying structures on one hand while then adding a new layer somewhere else. So we have very clear roles and responsibilities, we're there and we are fully engaged in those conversations happening on a Four Nations basis around that new body.
And the reason I'm asking that is because I read the full recommendations and what is set out, as you thankfully have referred to, recommendation 1 and recommendation 10, but particularly that paragraph are at odds with each other, in my opinion. And so, and I understand that each of the devolved jurisdictions will have their own approach and should have their own approach. But in terms of being having a more simplified approach and being as transparent as possible, a new statutory body, in my opinion, without any explanation, just dropped in like that, it doesn't read well. In terms of lessons learnt, so this is in relation to Module 1 and Module 2 will report. In terms of how information is presented to you, so for example, if there was, as you referred to, I think somewhere as a novel infection or something, I can't remember the right term, but what facilities do you have to interrogate what you've been told, by example, by the Chief Scientific Advisor, just as an example?
I think we're in a stronger position now than what we had been. Talk through the development of the NI Hub and the growth in staff in TEO from the 6 pre-pandemic to 25 now. So we've got policy officers looking at a number of these issues in detail. So it's the other bit that we're saying, some of what that has included is having statisticians embedded then within the hub, even now, and within the team. So able to interrogate data sets as they come through. Think about that. The other key development has been the appointment of the Chief Scientific and Technical Advisor in TEO. So part of their role as well is provide that oversight and another view and another perspective. So there's a couple of new...
So the CSA is actually in TEO now rather than in health?
There are 3 departments that have their own science and technical advisors. So Department of Health has one, DERA has one, and TEO now has one as well.
Okay, but in the event of a pandemic, God forbid, but in the event of another pandemic, which scientific advisor is going to have the biggest influence? Because in my opinion, the way in which information came was often done in such a way that you had to constantly ask for refinement in order to make a decision. So
I'm not sure I could answer that today, to be honest. The TEO CSTA appointment has been relatively recent. What I could say is there is that network of them that operate across the service now. What I would say though is in a pandemic, in a future pandemic, if God forbid there was one, Department of Health would continue to be the lead government department in terms of that. So they will clearly have a role there. Yeah. It's then that broader role that TEO can bring in terms of where the societal impacts lie. So there will be a balance in there, but I couldn't say definitively, who takes precedent or takes primacy in that.
And it talks about a new cross-departmental pandemic resilience programme board led jointly by DOH and TEO. Because the concerns I have is effectively you're leaving the recommendation in the hands of 2 people, the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor on behalf of health into an executive. And I just want to know how can you ensure that any ministers will be better prepared and more resilient in terms of being able to question what 2 people can say?
So the role of that Pandemic Resilience Programme Board is Ron said, that's exactly what it says in the tin. It's to be more resilient for a future pandemic. That's a cross-departmental board, so there's representation from all departments there, and it's there not just to consider lessons learned from COVID, but also to plan for the next pandemic whenever that comes. Hopefully taking those lessons learned and the experience to put us in a better place and have better information, better data, and to be more professional in terms of some of the disciplines and people that are in there. So that's the whole ethos of that board. Now, some of this will be tested, and the response to Module 1 talks at Recommendation 6 about exercise Pegasus later in the year, so the whole system test. So some of that will play through then, I would expect.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Harry, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you. I just think in terms of civil contingencies, are there any actions or recommendations being put in place already, or are you waiting until everything's all together?
We have been implementing changes to civil contingencies to the group and to the hub on an iterative basis right through the pandemic. So not necessarily waiting on recommendations to be made for us to start doing those things. Some of the examples would be, even while the pandemic was ongoing, the development of the civil contingencies framework that was published in 2021, revised in 23, and then will be revised subsequently again to take account of those recommendations. So we're not necessarily waiting. Now obviously if new recommendations are made that kind of we're not cited on, the work will start then, but there's a lot ongoing.
So as new stuff comes in,
our work programme may expand,
yeah.
But it doesn't mean that nothing's happening until then.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Okay, Anya, please.
Thank you, Chair. And just in relation to, I think it's recommendation 9, that's in air packs and red teams. Could you just expand a wee bit on, I suppose, exactly how the development of that came about?
Could I say a wee bit about what a red team is, first of all, if that helps?
Absolutely, yeah.
Would you mind picking up just in terms of how that recommendation came about from
Yeah.
the Inquiry's perspective. So in terms of red team, the idea and the concept is that it is an independent group of people who will come in and basically live test and challenge your plans. Used in the cyber world quite a lot in terms of having ethical hackers and things like that. So it's the same sort of idea that we applied to plans here. There's volumes of material about how they should run, how they would operate, and then there's different scales in terms of where a red team is most appropriate to use. So is it on your kind of cross-societal emergency, is it on individual emergency plans, and there's tiers that you can apply. So that's the background in terms of where that is. My view, and Jane can correct me if I'm wrong, in terms of the Inquiry's perspective on this and how that recommendation has come about, is that when we are considering our plans and preparing for any emergency, not just a pandemic, but any emergency, it's about getting that external assurance, someone else to come and test and poke and probe your plan, see if it actually holds up to scrutiny, and to identify the weaknesses early on that then you can go and address. But
Yeah.
I might be wrong.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So it's not just plans, it's policies as they develop, and just to make sure that then what is actually implemented has been tested before it hits the ground. But obviously it is red teams on their own aren't sufficient for that. So, and there's definitely a place for them, but there's other assurance mechanisms in place that can be used in conjunction with that to make sure that things are sufficiently tested on an independent basis.
And Jean, you just touched, I suppose, on independence there. How would these individuals be, I suppose, scouted by yourselves? Is there any set criteria there at all?
Not at the moment. That's work in progress.
Not at the
It's
moment.
all-
It's work in progress. I would say that we're in a slightly different position in terms of the use of red teams than, in particular, the UK government would use them in quite a lot of separate disciplines. So there's there's a pool of knowledge there. But in terms of a methodology for deploying red teams here, that is being developed and learning from best practice elsewhere.
Thank you. And look, I suppose I'm not going to dwell on the red teams, Chair. You mentioned that there is obviously ethical considerations in this as well, and I'm assuming there will be information and data that any of those individuals will be obviously privy to at quite a high level. So I'm assuming that there will be vetting, if you want to put it like that, or again, is that still being developed?
I would expect so, but I would say it's still being developed. I mean, the nature of some civil contingency work means there is vetting required, and there are clearances required to access some of it. So I would expect that to be there, but
No, that's okay. In relation to, I suppose, any future pandemics, just around scientific modelling, has there been any moves at the minute? And look, granted, it's probably a question that the Department of Health may be able to answer rather than yourselves, but has there been any move towards new modelling based on, well, I suppose, pandemic modelling?
I think it is more appropriate a question for Department of Health in terms of the modelling specifically. What I would say though, and what we've seen through the Pandemic Resilience Programme Board, is there's probably a more sophisticated approach to modelling early on, and there are better warning systems in place in terms of anticipating early on, where there is an emerging issue on a global level that then might develop to a pandemic. Now, not necessarily getting that far, but there are definitely more sophisticated systems in place.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Brian, please.
Thank you. And in terms of recommendation 6, regular UK-wide pandemic response exercise, I think it's exercise Pegasus taking place this autumn, which I presume you're taking the lead on. Will the public be aware that that is taking place, or is that something that's just happening behind the scenes among statutory agencies, or will the public be affected by that exercise being underway?
First thing to say is that we aren't leading on it, so it's Department of Health lead. Because the pandemic is related to a pandemic, so they would be the lead, although TEO definitely offering that support and being the kind of the next lead, if you want to call it that, in terms of where the societal impacts come.
You'll have a role in it, though?
We absolutely, but it won't just be us that has a role.
Yeah.
All departments will have a role. There's potential for it to involve ministers as well as unpacks. I mean, that's the information that's been provided in public so far. In terms of then whether there is a public awareness or consciousness of it, it has been published within our response that it's going to happen. It's been published within the UK government's response that it is happening. I'm not sure of engagement plans broader than that, but given the nature of it and the scale of it, it's a whole system. It's a all 4 nations involved exercise that will last over a period of 3 months on various days.
3 months?
It won't be 3 months altogether, but there will be set days where things are happening. I would expect to get some sort of attention.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Timothy, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. So I have this right in my head. So the recommendations or the responses to the UK COVID inquiry, the 10 questions, was that agreed by the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, by the Executive?
Executive.
So that was
It went through the Executive, yes.
Yeah.
Our response to it went through Executive, yeah.
So you compiled it in the Executive Office and got sign-off to all the responses?
It was compiled on a cross-departmental basis, and then went through the NICS board up to the Executive.
Yeah. It certainly seems that the Executive is happy to take the money out of, so when it was through COVID, for any of the schemes, furlough and whatever else come out to help businesses and help support people, but they don't seem happy to take direction from the Cabinet Office going forward. That's certainly what comes across in the response. One of the issues with COVID was that Unionists were very keen to follow the Cabinet Office and Nationalists were very keen to follow down south. Has that been resolved, or is that still a problem you see in the future?
I didn't hear the last bit, sorry.
Yeah,
Would you
so
mind repeating it?
one of the problems with COVID was that Unionists were very much focused on looking at what the Cabinet Office was doing, whereas Nationalists were very much focused on what the Irish Republic was doing. Has that issue been resolved? So if there is another outbreak of COVID or such, going forward, will we still have the same problem?
I'm not sure that's something I can answer to, I'm afraid. It's everything is that kind of impact would be considered on a cross-executive basis, so therefore it takes all views into account.
Yep, page 5, what we have here. Given the potential cross-cutting nature of civil contingencies that may touch upon all aspects of society and therefore on the responsibilities of all Northern Ireland, Northern is spelt wrong, ministers, the Executive is ideally placed to provide ministerial oversight of civil contingencies arrangement. I suppose my problem with that statement is that if we look back to COVID, there's absolutely no recognition of the role the First Minister played, who was heading up the government, of how she undermined the COVID restrictions by her attendance at the mass IRA funeral, while the rest of the population were unable to have funerals for their bereaved. This is a confidence issue for me. So to say that the Executive is ideally placed to provide ministerial oversight, I think, yes, it has been a number of years since COVID. It has been a number of years of the flagrant breaches, but within many families, they will never forgive what they seen in the streets of Belfast that day, where many families who were bereaved couldn't bury their loved ones and give them the burial that they so wished to, but yet we had the funeral procession in Belfast that the First Minister took part in. So going forward, regardless of what happens, confidence has been shattered in this Executive, certainly in this First Minister, to be heading up an Executive that says they're ideally placed to provide ministerial oversight. Moving on to recommendation 1. So the TEO basically rejects recommendation 1, and that's come about by, once again, a First Minister who couldn't follow the guidance that was in place at the time. It appears to me that the Executive, half of it, doesn't want to follow the Cabinet Office because it's Unionists, and vice versa. They want to follow what they're doing down south. Recommendation 3, same idea again, partly TEO no better than the Cabinet Office. Page 133. So what we're looking at here is the recurring the recurring reports that'll be coming out every 3 years. When can we expect to see the first one of those?
Reports for the Assembly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We are developing a proposal that will go to the executive in terms of the format for those reports, because it's not just there are quite a number of factors that need to be included. Can I come back to something else you've mentioned there before? You said that the executive has rejected recommendation 1. Page 3 of the response specifically says the executive therefore accept this recommendation in full in relation to recommendation 1. In relation to the language that has been used there, and Jane again can correct me if I'm wrong, but when it talks about the executive being ideally placed to coordinate, that's specifically in relation to the first bullet point of that recommendation that's been made by the inquiry. So that recommendation said that the core structures, in terms of a simplified structure, should be a single cabinet level or equivalent ministerial committee, which we have in terms of the executive. So that's what that relates back to. So that's not replacing anything else. It's not duplicating. It's not confusing structures. It's basically saying there's a structure that we have that can be used like this.
That was just to say that was in recognition of the fact that we've been asked to look at structures to make sure they're streamlined as possible. So we were keen not to create another ministerial group, but to use the existing one.
Yeah. Can I also just say, in terms of some of the language about not following the Cabinet Office, and again, to Jane, probably more familiar with some of the language that we have used here, I don't think that there is any language in here that says we are disagreeing with the Cabinet Office. In fact, what we continually reiterate within this is that we're committed to working on a four nations basis, which is UKG, Scotland, Wales and ourselves, a Cabinet Office there. And to be totally clear, Cabinet Office hasn't made these recommendations. They are chiefly in the lead for implementing some of them, and we're working with them on that. So it's not a case of TO falling out of step with them. In fact, we've committed throughout to working with them.
Yeah, recommendation number 10. We are, however, conscious of the constrained position we find ourselves in with regard to public finances here. What bearing has that?
Well, the proposal recommendation is that there be an independent statutory commission or a body set up to kind of have oversight of civil contingencies. We know from experience that's a very expensive undertaking, so it's something that we just want to make sure the public are aware that whilst we're looking at it and how we can meet the spirit of the recommendation, at least we have to make sure that the public purse is protected as well.
Can you put a price in that?
No, I don't have one to hand.
That has not been costed in terms of what that commission would look like, to my knowledge anyway.
When I read the likes of that, and you're saying you can't put a cost on it at the minute, but last week we were hearing about the Climate Commissioner that's going to cost £1 million. We were told in Assembly this week a minimum of £1 million, but yet when it comes to this response, we're conscious of the constrained position we find ourselves in financially. To me, it looks as if the priorities aren't in the right places. Going through what we have in the tabled papers, just a couple of questions to finish off with. Number 11, and it's touching again on the capital bid. So it was a bid for capital funding of 580. Has that been accepted? Has that been successful?
I haven't yet got confirmation of our budget for next year, so it's at this stage still a bid.
And can you give us a breakdown of what that 580,000 would be spent on? And then it'll give us an idea following on from what Stuart really said of if the bid isn't successful, what we're not getting.
I don't know that I can provide a breakdown of, an itemised breakdown. What I can say is that's a cost that's been arrived at in consultation with CPD, so the Construction and Procurement Division within DOF in terms of capital works. So it's a reasonable estimate for the cost, but I don't know that we would even have an itemised offer to provide yet. What was the second question? Sorry.
What happens if it's
Aye,
not?
so if the bid isn't successful,
What are the options?
We're not getting
We can come back to that in terms of what it is. So the development for that project is very well advanced. We're expecting that to commence, but we're expecting confirmation of where we're at with a budget on this within days. So we'll be able to plan it.
Finally, paragraph 23. In the last year, although 182 people across the public sector have been trained in various aspects of crisis management by the division staff. So is that internal training, or who is providing the oversight, the expertise in that?
So the expertise is someone that we have appointed on a special contract who has experience of delivering training in this area across a number of sectors. The training has been delivered not just to internals in terms of civil servants, but it's been multi-agency. So you've got councils in there, you've got police, fire and rescue service, ambulance, so it's broader, whole public
It's
sector.
a consultation piece. You brought somebody in and to carry out that has, as you're saying, the expertise in that.
Well, the nature of their contract isn't something I'm going to go into here, but there's someone who has the relevant expertise to be delivering that training and development.
And is that the need you would identify that instead of bringing somebody in, that we have somebody within our structures that can do that?
Ideally, where we would like to get to is that, and it's been mentioned within here about train the trainer type programs, and that's something we're delivering this year, is to expand and professionalise not just civil contingencies, competence and discipline, but actually to make sure that it is continual as a part of personal development. So it is something that we're working on to make sure right across departments we're not relying on one or two people, we're actually, it's a whole system approach, trainers embedded in all departments.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't think anybody's indicating to come back in, so thank you so much for your work, and you can just keep us posted. We'd appreciate that and stuff going forward. Thank you. Okay, members, I don't think there were any actions out of that, Clerk, were there? Or?
Yeah, there's two just
sorry.
where the official undertook to provide in that he would come back and give us clarification.
Sorry, it was yes. Yeah, go ahead.
580,000 in the bin.
Yes, exactly. So we've whether the notes and minutes of the CCGNI were published, and if they were, are they publicly available?
And going forward,
And going forward, will they be? So the official said he would check and respond to us on that, so we'll follow that up. And secondly, the second one is a breakdown of the 580 million, what this covers, and if you can't tell us exactly. 1,000. What breakdown of what that covers, and if they can't tell us a detailed breakdown, could they tell us what we're not getting in more general terms?
So if the bid isn't accepted, what does that mean?
Yes, yeah. And the third one there is that last one, just where he asked, where you asked about the contract to deliver the training expertise. Did you ask, were there long-term plans?
Did
he answer it?
Yeah, it was exploring instead of bringing somebody in, is it more beneficial to have somebody? Because if you're training 182 people across the public sector, and he sort of hinted at train the trainer and capacity building internally to roll it out.
Okay, so just those two queries?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Could I ask, Chair, maybe I should have asked really whether the officials were in, but whether is there any funding allocation directly from Westminster for these civil contingency planning and
implementing
expenses?
Recommendations?
Because it's right, across a range of issues, storms, potential terrorism, emergency pandemics, that planning's in place and where there's actual capital investment. But is there any additional support directly from Westminster?
Or consequentials?
Because rather than just falling on the block grant, or coming out of the block grant.
That's a good question. Yep.
Additional support directly from Westminster for the costs.
The costs, of the increasing cost of civil contingencies.
Okay, no, that was good one, thank you. Okay, members, moving on. Correspondence. I've got quite a lot to read through here, but we need to read them into the record, so please bear with me. So I'm going to refer you to pages 145 to 150 of the pack for the summary of committee correspondence, and I'm going to draw your attention to a number of items. So 8.2, Committee for Communities, terms of reference for civil servants undertaking co-design work, and you'll find this in pages 151 to 152 of your meeting pack. Just to advise that the Committee for Communities has written to the Executive Office in relation to the terms of reference for civil servants undertaking co-design work, following a briefing with the Women's Policy Group NI on the Gender Equality Strategy and Conrad and Gaeilge in relation to the Irish Language Strategy. The committee wrote to the Executive Office to ask that consideration be given to producing terms of reference or guidance for civil servants who are entering into co-design with subject matter and lived experience experts to ensure consistency of approach and experience for those groups. And just to advise you to note this item of correspondence and to ask your agreement to consider the correspondence further if necessary when the committee is copied into the reply. Are we content?
Great.
Great. Okay, so Moving on then, Public Engagement Manager in relation to the Balmoral Show 2025. You'll find this correspondence on page 155 to 156 of your pack. And just to advise that the Public Engagement Manager has written to the committee regarding the 2025 Balmoral Show. The Assembly Commission will be hosting a marquee at this year's event. A full roster of engagement activities is planned. They will be interactive, showcasing the work of the Assembly and promoting our programmes and tours or other business areas. For example, Education Services and the Youth Assembly will periodically be present to promote their work and engage with the audience. This has the potential for committee participation at the show, and it was discussed at the Chairs Liaison Group, and the engagement team are now writing to each statutory committee to formalise arrangements. So just to advise, if the committee decides that they would like to participate, then this would need to be regarding a specific area of our work, and the committee would need to decide by Friday the 11th of April. So we have an opportunity next week maybe to come back to this if anybody's any ideas. So note the correspondence and any initial ideas and thoughts on whether we should attend, and if so, in terms of what we would actually like to speak to. Maybe return to it next week. Okay?
I'm not sure that I see something that we could publicly engage broadly.
Yeah. Okay. So it's really just about what we could publicly engage with. Because of the nature of the work for the Executive Office on this committee. Okay, so Queen's University, so we've had an invitation to a seminar. You'll find that on page 194. And this was received from the Centre for Public Policy and Administration at Queen's for the potential for AI in the public sector. This will take place on Tuesday the 15th of April, and members have received a hold date previously, but registration is now opened, and just ask you to note this correspondence and that you can register with the link included in the invitation. 8.9, the Equality Coalition UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So on pages 197 to 198, you'll find this correspondence that the committee has received, highlighting a recent recommendation from the UN Committee on ESCR and its direct relevance to the committee's ongoing inquiry, i.e. to ensure the adoption of a comprehensive anti-discrimination and equality law, particularly in Northern Ireland, in accordance with Article 2 of the Covenant and guided by the committee's general comment number 20, 2009 on non-discrimination in economic, social and cultural rights. So I'm just asking you to note this correspondence and to seek your agreement that the clerk includes this for reference in the consideration of recommendations for the inquiry. 8.11, the Executive Office, we've received a response to correspondence from the 18th of February in terms of the draft refugee strategy and delivery framework. You'll find this at page 203 to 205 in the meeting pack. So we've received this response from the department issued following the departmental briefing on the draft refugee integration strategy. The committee requested information on Home Office funding and its allocation locally. The information has been provided in tabular format and relates to the 2024-25 financial year. It also includes funding provided by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, which leads on operational delivery on some schemes, primarily the Ukrainian visa scheme. The total allocation to EU was £6,291,081 for the 2024-25 financial year. So just asking you to note this and to seek your agreement to consider writing the department to ask them that they keep the committee updated on any executive or Whitehall departmental plans to extend or replace the funding beyond 31st of March. What changes are expected in the funding structure and overall allocation, when final decisions on funding structures will be confirmed, and how the department plans to ensure continuity of support for refugees in the absence of any continued funding. Are we content that we write back to the department for those questions? Great, thank you. So 8.11, the Executive Office response to correspondence on the Victims Payment Scheme, and you'll find this on pages 206 to 250 in your meeting pack. So the committee has received a response to correspondence issued following the departmental briefing on the strategy for victims and survivors of the Troubles / Conflict 2024 to 2034. The committee requested a written briefing on the criteria for the Troubles Permanent Disablement Payment Scheme, including for the families of victims, which has been provided at Annex 1 and 2 of the correspondence. So asking you to note this and seek members' agreement to add this written briefing as a relevant paper for the Victims Payment Scheme panel stakeholder session due to take place on Wednesday the 21st of May. We agreed?
Great.
Okay, 8.13, individual correspondence request for extension of the HII redress scheme. So you'll find this page 216 of your pack. The committee has received further correspondence from an individual from the 26th of March meeting in relation to the HIA redress scheme. So the committee agreed at the meeting on the 26th of March to write to this individual to express the committee's sympathy and to signpost them to the Victims and Survivors Service, who do provide dedicated and specialist long-term support and services to survivors of HIA. This letter was sent to the individual on 28th of March. So this individual has contacted the committee again on behalf of his father regarding the redress scheme and applying on behalf of a deceased family member. His further correspondence relates to the extension of the scheme, which was due to close today, and just asking you to note this correspondence and seek members' agreement to respond to the individual, explaining that the committee does not have the power to extend the redress scheme and that this power lies with the executive office, and seeking the individual's consent to forward this correspondence to the executive office for a response. So are we agreed? Okay, so we've some items carried forward from last week. 8.13, that was the news release from the executive office on the junior ministers welcoming guests to the Ulster Friday on St Patrick's Day in Brussels. 8.4, the news release from the executive office where the ministers affirmed commitment to ethnic equality monitoring. Item 8.6, correspondence from Pivotal, who have published a report entitled Achieving Greater Integration in Education and Housing. And you may wish to note these items as well. Then the Hansard report on the departmental briefing on the Programme for Government consultation report and impact assessment from our meeting of the 12th of March, and the response to the committee correspondence issued on the 18th of February following a briefing session from Advice and I on immigration matters. So do members want to discuss any of those items? Raise any issues in relation to them? No? Okay, so draft forward work programme, members, you'll find this in pages 216 to 220 of the pack, and I'm going to ask the Assistant Clerk to talk through any changes in the forward work programme, please.
Thanks, Chair. There's just one briefing now which has been scheduled. So the new Commissioner for Older People, Miss Siobhan Casey, so she'll be attending the committee on the 2nd of July, just before summer recess.
Okay.
And that's everything that's updated this week.
Okay, anybody want to comment on the forward work programme? Go ahead, please.
The prevalence and impact of adverse childhood experiences in Northern Ireland. There's a report published in February 2025, the Executive Programme on Paramilitarism and Organised Crime.
Yes.
Would that be something that would be good for the committee to get some sort of briefing on?
We have, I think that is sitting as something that we could potentially do with the Justice Committee as well. So it is on the radar.
Yeah.
Are we actively looking to see if that could be accommodated?
That we are aware of it, and I think going forward with the other items that we're going to discuss with Justice going forward, that
Yeah.
We can look at
that
a
wider.
date.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
And something regarding ministerial questions. So we've talked before about the poor response from the Executive Office. So we can't get any response in writing. Is it something we need to plan into the forward work programme, that we bring somebody from the department in front of us to give us an idea of what the problems are, why ministers aren't responding in time? Is it civil servant issue regarding lack of staffing, or is it getting signed off by ministers?
Are these assembly questions written? So that's individuals. But we have, I know you've raised it before. Do you want to speak to that?
Yes, it is. So last week it was included in the response that went back following, for the department. So it was the last item that we looked, that was included last week. And I will bring you a paper. I owe you a paper about the timescales for this. And in terms of asking for a briefing on it, I think when it was discussed originally, we said that we would ask in the first instance for a written briefing. And we're looking at the forward work programme, strategic planning, on the end of the meeting next week, so we can look at it at the opportunity for a date at that point, so we can put in the request.
Okay. Any other business, members?
One thing I would like to raise is on the back of the media of the Ballymena bunker. Obviously it sits with the Executive Office, and is there any chance this committee could, maybe something that's been discussed before I came, about a list of our assets and getting an idea of how much we're spending a year in health and safety issues in them, so that if media interest like this comes again, at least somebody in the Executive Office or the committee is armed with information that you could respond to it, whereas it was news to me. I know a number of years ago when I was in council, when it was up for sale, we looked at potentially turning it into some sort of an attraction and opening it up for the public. It can't just sit there forever.
No.
There needs to be some sort of direction given of what's happening with that asset in the future.
I wonder, so are we then maybe wanting a list of the facilities and property like that they have to, facilities that they have to manage and insure, etc., and then the costs associated with that? Because I think there's obviously Maze Long Cash is another one there where they have, obviously they've a board there, but okay, we could maybe put that request in.
Yeah, is it just TEO's assets?
Yeah, I think
For our committee, yeah.
Other committees do their own.
Absolutely.
Yeah, TEO's assets. Okay. So a list of the TEO assets, the cost of maintaining them.
Yeah.
and aren't being used.
Yeah.
And usage plans.
Yes.
Yeah, so we've got that back. It might even be something we could maybe bring them in once we get the written report. Okay, any other business members? No. Okay, thanks everybody. Thank you.
Committee Room 30, Sound.